This is KGNU Boulder, 88.5 FM, and KGNU Denver, 1390 AM, with translator K229AC in Ward, Colorado, at 93.7 megahertz. It's 7:59. David Barsamian talks with Noam Chomsky about Lebanon, Palestine, and Iraq.
This is David Barsamian. Noam Chomsky, MIT professor and founder of modern linguistics, is regarded internationally as one of the foremost critics of the depredations of U.S. foreign policy. From Tokyo to Toronto, he regularly appears on major media. It's quite a different story in the United States. To take just one example, he's been on the vaunted News Hour with Jim Lehrer on PBS once in the 30 years that program has been on the air. KGNU Denver Boulder, in contrast, has featured Chomsky perhaps more than any other media in the United States. Chomsky's latest books are Failed States and the bestseller Imperial Ambitions. I talked with him in his office at MIT late on Tuesday afternoon. Welcome to the program, Noam Chomsky.
Glad to be here again.
The official story about Lebanon goes like this. Israel acted in self-defense after Hezbollah in a cross-border attack on July 12th, killed 3 of its soldiers and captured 2. And the president has said Hezbollah attacked Israel, Hezbollah started the crisis. Any holes in the official story?
Quite a lot of holes. The narrow facts are accurate. However, it's necessary to point out that the United States and Israel have no objection whatsoever to capture of soldiers and even to the much more serious crime of kidnapping of civilians. Israel's been kidnapping and abducting Lebanese for decades. No one has ever suggested that anyone should invade Israel. In fact, just to make it more dramatic, the recent upsurge of violence did not begin on July 12th. It began on June 25th, 26th, 27th, right after Hamas captured an Israeli soldier right at the border and also killed, I forget how many soldiers. That led to the huge upsurge of violence. And I say upsurge, 36 Palestinians were killed by Israel in June in Gaza, and over 170 in July. So that's a quadrupling of the Israeli violence in a month. That's June 25th. Something happened on June 24th, one day earlier. Namely, Israeli forces kidnapped and abducted 2 civilians in Gaza, 2 Palestinian civilians, a doctor and his brother. It was known. You found occasional mentions of it. There were 87 words in the Washington Post, for example, and a couple of other mentions here and there, but it wasn't, nobody reacted, no comment. No one suggested that one should invade Israel and half destroy it. Capture of civilians, kidnapping of civilians is a much more extreme crime than capture of soldiers, and as I say, it goes way back. So that cannot, by our standards, our own standards, there's no justification whatsoever for the U.S.-Israeli attack on Lebanon. That's one point. Another is that whatever one thinks of the Hezbollah action, it did have reasons, official reasons. 2. One official reason was exchange of prisoners. Well, go back a couple of months. In February, about 70% of Lebanese, and they don't like Hezbollah particularly, but 70% of them were in favor of capture of Israeli soldiers for exchange of prisoners, because they know perfectly well that Israel's been, we don't know the numbers because it's all kept secret, but Israel has indeed been kidnapping and often killing Lebanese civilians for decades. And remember, this is the 5th invasion of Lebanon. It's not the first. So that's one point. The other, what their official claim was expression of solidarity and support for Gazans who were under bitter attack, escalating again in late June. In the entire Arab world, there is no meaningful support for Israel other than Hezbollah. Well, again, you can think about it what you like, but those are the 2 official reasons. I think most specialists on Hezbollah take that to be pretty accurate account of what they were doing. So again, judge it as you like. Yes, kidnapping You can't kidnap soldiers. That's a logical impossibility. But capture of soldiers was an international crime of whatever level it is, the crime that Israel and the United States carry out all the time, much more seriously. No justification for any violent retaliation. But it happened. However, there's, of course, a very rich background. The basic background is barely even discussed. Gaza is bad enough, in fact, horrible. But the background for that is that the immediate background, of course, much longer, is that in January, there was a free election in Palestine, and they voted the wrong way. You're not allowed to vote the wrong way in a free election. That's our concept of democracy. It's fine as long as you do what we say. But if you vote for someone we don't like, no good. So instantly, Israel and the United States instituted harsh punishment of Palestinians, cutting off funds, stepping up atrocities, starving them out to punish the people of Palestine for voting the wrong way in a free election. It tells you pretty much what is meant by democracy promotion. And yes, Israel stepped up its crimes in Gaza, and which were already serious, and it, as Israeli human rights groups point out, it's turned Gaza into the biggest prison in the world. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, where something even more serious going on, Israel, with U.S. backing, as always, is carrying out a program which euphemistically is called convergence, and is described in the United States as withdrawal. In fact, what it is annexation and cantonization. They're annexing valuable land and the major resources, particularly water, designing settlement and infrastructure projects so as to break up the shrinking Palestinian territories into unviable cantons, virtually separated from one another, and all virtually separated from whether tiny corner of Jerusalem is to be left to Palestinians as the center of their commercial, educational, cultural life. And it's all being imprisoned because Israel's taking over, again, with U.S. backing, taking over the Jordan Valley. So a couple of prisons being established in the West Bank, a major prison in Gaza. Gaza and the West Bank are a unit. Everyone agrees to that. So if resistance to this occupation is legitimate in the West Bank, and I'd like to hear an argument to the contrary, it's also legitimate in Gaza. That's another, of course, all totally illegal in violation of Security Council orders, World Bank court decisions, and so on. And it's very harsh and brutal, as it's been for years. So, yes, there's quite a lot of background.
Well, in both cases, Lebanon and in Gaza, the crises were precipitated by the capturing of Israeli soldiers. At the same time, both of the political formations that are involved, Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Palestine, do not recognize Israel, are, according to many, dedicated to its eradication, and are launching missiles, Qassam rockets in the case of Gaza, and Katyusha and other rockets from Lebanon.
Well, first of all, to stress again, the crisis erupted on June 25th, not on June 24th, and the reason for that is crucial, and we should keep remembering it. It's because Israel and the United States and the media and Britain and Europe do not care about kidnapping of civilians, which is a much more serious crime than capture of soldiers. But they don't care as long as it's being done by our side. The timing illustrates that dramatically, which I presume is the reason why what happened on June 24th is being pretty much suppressed. It's just too dramatic, and it's been going on for years. Hezbollah, Hamas, start with them, did observe, it stopped after Israeli atrocities picked up again. It had observed a truce for a year and a half. There were Qassam rockets fired. It's criminal and foolish, but not by Hamas. And we know the reason. I mean, it's a reaction to continuing atrocities and takeover of and the annexation cantonization programs. They're in the West Bank, but that's a unit. However, Hamas did observe a year and a half of truce. Israel refused to accept that and continued assassinations, bombings, and so on. And of course, cutting off of funds, etc. And Hamas has indicated repeatedly that what it's calling for is a long-term truce, indefinite truce, no violence, and negotiations on a two-state settlement when Israel commits itself to withdrawing from the occupied territories. What about Hezbollah? First of all, as far as rockets are concerned, the UN keeps very careful records of what goes on that border. They've registered hundreds of Israeli violations of the border daily, in fact, overflights, sonic booms, and so on, all violations. They have not recorded one case of a Hezbollah rocket from May 2000, when Israel withdrew, up till July 2006. Not a single case. There were some rockets, but not attributed to Hezbollah, the Palestinians. So the number of rockets is apparently zero until the lasted upsurge. Hezbollah's position is that they don't regard Israel as a legitimate state. They don't think it ought to exist. However, Nasrallah, the leader, has said repeatedly that Hezbollah will accept whatever Palestinians accept. If they accept a two-state settlement, Hezbollah won't like it, but they'll accept it. Incidentally, the Iranian position is exactly the same. The West loves Ahmadinejad's crazed outbursts, but he has a superior, the so-called supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who is in charge. He's declared that Iran accepts the Arab League position. The Arab League position is normalization of relations with Israel in a two-state settlement on the international border, which is in fact the international consensus. So, they don't like it, but they've said they would accept it. In fact, it's odd that the question is always raised the way you put it, but which is a little, what somebody's watching from another planet, they think is a little odd, because the only two countries that do not, major ones that do not accept this settlement, are the United States and Israel. And they not only refuse it in rhetoric, but they're implementing programs which will make it impossible to realize it. Implementation is far more significant than rhetoric. So the right question to ask is, what are we going to do about the fact that the United States and Israel continue, as they have for the past 30 years, to reject and to block a diplomatic settlement of the Israel-Palestine problem, and in fact to render it impossible by their illegal actions? That's the question we ought to ask.
You met with Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, when you were in Lebanon. What was your take on him?
About the same as the take of everyone else I've seen who met him. For example, Edward Peck, who was a high figure in the counterterrorism under the Reagan administration. I read his description after I'd been there, and I noticed it was exactly the same as mine. He said, seems reasonable, pragmatic, answers the questions you ask, thoughtful. You can like what he says or not, but you're getting serious answers to serious questions. And his reasons for the most controversial position he takes on Israel, he says what he said publicly, what I just said. The most controversial position has to do with maintaining weapons. And his argument, which actually I spent even more time in Lebanon, this is never reported, with the strongest opponents of Hezbollah. So my two friends I went with from here, and I and my wife went to the Mukhtar, Walid Jumblatt's palace up in his Druze fiefdom. He's the strongest opponent of Hezbollah. We spent quite a few hours there talking to him and to Shibli Malat, who's Maronite presidential candidate, constitutionalist, also very anti-Hezbollah. And I asked them and others in Lebanon what their answer was to Hezbollah's reasoning. And, unfortunately, nobody had an answer. And I don't know the answer. Their reasoning is that the question goes back to a preliminary question. Does Lebanon deserve to have a deterrent to U.S.-Israeli aggression? Now, that's not an abstract question. The current invasion of Lebanon is the fifth invasion in the last 30 years. Every one of them has been destructive and violent. One of them, 1982, wiped out a large part of Lebanon, killed probably 20,000 people. This is not a joke. So do they have a right to a deterrent? Well, if nobody has a right to a deterrent against U.S.-Israeli aggression, okay, question's answered. No, they don't have a right to deterrent. Nobody does. The U.S. and Israel are allowed to invade anyone they like. If they do have a right to a deterrent, what is it to be? It can't be the Lebanese army. That's much too weak and much too penetrated by the United States. There could be a credible deterrent, namely a U.S. commitment to stop an Israeli invasion. Well, it'd be nice to have maybe an asteroid will land on the Earth tomorrow, too. That's our problem. If people like you and me and others in the United States cannot provide that deterrent, then that doesn't count. Well, what's the alternative? Hezbollah's argument is that the only thing that deters Israel is guerrilla warfare, nothing else, which prevents them from carrying out a land occupation. They've, after all, occupied Lebanon illegally in violation of Security Council orders for 22 years with U.S. support, and pretty brutal and oppressive. So what's the other answer? That did drive them out, finally. So their answer is, well, okay, that's the only deterrent. Actually, the government of Lebanon is ambivalent about this. The prime minister, who's a Sunni, not pro-Hezbollah, Fuad Signora, his position and that of the government was that Resolution 1559, which Security Council, which calls for disarmament of militias, he says does not apply to Hezbollah because it's not a militia, it's a resistance force. Well, okay, you can agree or not agree with the government of Lebanon, but it's not a meaningless. It's not gibberish. It needs an answer. So what is the deterrent? You can say, like the White House and the media would, that they don't have a right to a deterrent because the United States and Israel must be free to do whatever they want. Okay, that's an answer. But if you don't accept that answer, well, what is it?
Well, to twist, you just mentioned UN Security Council Resolution 1559. To twist an Orwell line, in Animal Farm, all Security Council resolutions are equal, except some are more equal than others. So 194, which calls for the right of return or compensation for Palestinians displaced from Palestine, is by the wayside. 242, 338, several on the annexation of Jerusalem, 497 on the Golan Heights. Talk about 1559, and I was interested in a comment that Tim Llewellyn, who used to work for the BBC, in an essay wrote. He calls it a unique interference by the Security Council in Lebanon's internal affairs. Is it unique?
It's I'd have to think to know whether it's actually unique. It certainly is unusual. The Security Council typically does not intervene in the internal affairs of other countries. A part of 1559 was not unique. That was the call for Syrian withdrawal. I mean, it was cynical and hypocritical. Syria entered Lebanon in 1976 with support of the United States and Israel. Because their task then was to kill Palestinians, so that was just fine. They stayed there with the support of the United States. The first Bush administration supported their remaining in Lebanon because they wanted to build up the coalition for the Gulf War. And now, the United States and France, for their own cynical reasons, decided, okay, they should withdraw. Yeah, they should withdraw. They should have withdrawn in 1976 when they were welcomed. So yes, that part is appropriate, though utterly hypocritical. But the other part about the internal affairs of Lebanon is, as he said, dubious. That's not the Security Council's job. And it was also ambiguous. Like Fuad Signora's and the government's interpretation is a possible interpretation. That was reiterated in the 1701, the latest resolution, but it remains ambiguous. It's up to the people of Lebanon to decide how they want to deal with the threat of U.S.-Israeli aggression. Incidentally, it's called Israeli invasion, but that's not true. The jet planes, the missiles, the cluster bomb munitions, the rest of it, they are made here. And they're provided to Israel in massive numbers, just precisely to permit aggression when they feel like doing it. So it's a U.S.-Israeli invasion, quite apart from the fact that the U.S. vetoed a call for ceasefire and then blocked it for weeks. So yes, it's direct participation in the invasion, as in the earlier ones.
That goes to a current article that Seymour Hersh has in the New Yorker, Watching Lebanon, Washington's interests in Israel's war. This actually follows up on a piece that was in the San Francisco Chronicle on July 21st. But Hersh writes, with his usual attribution to high administration sources and anonymous insiders. The Bush administration, however, was closely involved in the planning of Israel's retaliatory attacks. President Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney were convinced. Current and former intelligent and diplomatic officials told me that a successful Israeli Air Force bombing campaign against Hezbollah's heavily fortified underground missile and command and control complexes in Lebanon could ease Israel's security concerns and also serve as a prelude to a potential American preemptive attack to destroy Iran's nuclear installations, some of which are also buried deep underground. What do you think of Hersh's reporting?
Well, he's a terrific reporter, and I'm sure he's reporting exactly what was told him. But his sources are intelligence officials and diplomats, unnamed, and their task is not to tell people the truth. Their task is to tell people what they want them to hear. May be true, may not be true, but you've got to understand that. Any report by any reporter from an unidentified intelligence or diplomatic source is reporting what they want you to believe. Okay, maybe what they want you to believe is correct, maybe they have some other reason and so on, but you always have to understand that. However, I have no sources at all, but I drew pretty much the same conclusions, with some modification. For one thing, it cannot be that the U.S. was involved in the detailed planning of the attack, because it took place instantly, within hours, in fact. So within hours of the capture of the soldiers, Israel began bombing. There was no time for any detailed plan. They obviously had contingency plans, of course. But like I'm sure they have contingency plans to drive the whole population of the West Bank into the Jordan or, the Gulf or something. But every state has contingency plans for everything. But so the plans were there. And the decision to implement them could have been made, probably was made in consultation with Washington, but no planning. Just say, give us a green light and we go ahead. The idea that one of the goals was to eliminate a deterrent, a Lebanese deterrent to a U.S. attack on Iran, you can be pretty confident that was true. And one of the deterrents to a potential U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran, if it ever happens, one of the deterrents is a Hezbollah attack on Israel in reaction to an invasion. Well, they wanted to eliminate. It's kind of like saying no country should have a right to a deterrent. Let's go back to that. One of the deterrents for Iran was southern Lebanon. Okay, they thought, rightly or wrongly, that with a massive air attack they could get rid of that. However, my own guess, and again, I don't have any sources, and there's no information. Governments don't give information to their population. If you've ever read secret documents, you know that the secrets are not are rarely for security. They're mostly for security of the state against its own people. You don't want the public to know what you're up to. Major enemy of most states is their own population. And here, too, they don't tell us what they're up to, so you have to speculate. But my strong suspicion is that the problem is there's no issue of Israeli security. And there's no, like I said, there were no Hezbollah rockets for 6 years. There were border incidents going both ways all the time, but they were contained. And there's disputed areas and so on. But the real issue is Palestine. Israel and the United States have definite plans for Palestine. We don't have to speculate about that because they're implementing them. They're called courageous withdrawal, but all you have to do is look at them to see what they are. They're annexation, cantonization, and imprisonment. Those are the plans for Palestine. Finishing off Palestinian nationalism. It's not a security issue. The only support in the Arab world, meaningful support, for Palestinians happens to be Hezbollah. All right, it follows almost like night follows day that Hezbollah has to be destroyed, whatever reason you may have or pretext you may have. Well, Hezbollah can't be destroyed. It's an integral part of Lebanese society. It's just, well, you know, I'll tell you, it's just part of Lebanese society. Well, follows again, just logically, you have to destroy Lebanon. And it's not the first time, you know, been doing it periodically. So sure, the invasion of Lebanon, destruction of much of Lebanon is rational on the assumption that you have to, you know, finish off with the Palestinians. And I suspect that's the core of it, getting rid of a deterrent to a potential attack on Iraq. Iran is another reason. So that much we can, I think, conclude plausibly without any sources.
Tanya Reinhart wrote a book called Israel-Palestine a couple of years ago, and she was reviewing some exchanges between Ariel Sharon and Ehud Barak, and this is what she wrote. As for the Northern Front, which is Lebanon, Sharon rejected Barak's ideas in 1982 as he was still hoping to create a new order in Lebanon. Since that failed and the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon turned out to be more and more costly over the years, Sharon developed a new plan. Israel should withdraw unilaterally from Lebanon. And in May of 2000 they did, thus achieving the world's recognition as the peaceful side. In the spirit of Barak's memo, Israel should then wait for some incident. Under the new circumstances, even the slightest incident will be viewed as a legitimate reason for Israel to launch a devastating attack against Lebanon and Syria.
I don't think, she's extremely acute and knows the situation very well and has to be taken very seriously and honest comment. She's an old friend, so take that into account. But I don't think they intend to attack Syria. My guess is the reason is that they would, if they're reasonable. I'm assuming rationality, which is, I think, is a fair assumption on Israel's case, not necessarily Cheney and Rumsfeld, but I think they would be concerned about the successor regime. And Assad is doing pretty much what they want. He's keeping quiet. He's letting Israel take over illegally, of course, annexing the Golan Heights, Syrian Golan Heights, not making much of a fuss about it. Syria is very weak, has no military force. So from Israel's point of view, it's more or less okay. And a successor regime is likely to be Islamic fundamentalist. You know, it's another Hezbollah, you know, which is the last thing they want. And it may turn to guerrilla warfare and other things that they can't handle. So my suspicion is they don't want to attack Syria. Lebanon, it's an old plan, goes way back, even before the state was established. There were ideas about setting up a client regime in Lebanon, a Maronite state. That certainly was Sharon, it's not a secret, it was Sharon's plan when he invaded in 1982. The main purpose of the invasion was to put an end to the embarrassing PLO calls for negotiations. They wanted to stop that and drive the PLO out of Lebanon so we can, again, it was a war to defend the West Bank. In fact, it was, to take over the West Bank. It was almost openly described that way, not unlike this one. And a secondary goal was to establish, to institute a Maronite client regime in Lebanon. And it may be, as Tanya Reinhart says, that that's still been a plan. Other Israeli commentators have also concluded that Uri Avnery, who's closer to the establishment, he's a critic, but he's probably closer to the establishment than Tanya is, has said the same thing. He said the goal of the invasion is to revitalize Sharon's old plan of restoring installing a Maronite kingdom, a goal that goes back to Ben-Gurion and others. So, yeah, maybe. I don't know. I kind of doubt it because it's just off. By now, you could imagine it in 1982. You could imagine you could get away with it. And, in fact, they almost did. But this time it's pretty hard to imagine. For one thing, the Maronites are split. One large segment, Michel Aoun, General Aoun, is linked more or less to Hezbollah, and they have nowhere near the power they had back in 82 when they had a big armed militia that Israel was supporting and so on.
Talk about the Israeli military. It has a vaunted reputation for performance in past wars. Siddharth Varadarajan, writing in The Hindu on August 14th, had this comment to make. More than 30 years of enforcing a military occupation and fighting children and poorly equipped guerrillas have clearly taken their toll on the ability of the legendary Israeli army to fight a full-fledged war.
Well, again, I'm no big military expert, but I don't quite agree with that. I think that if Israel was to have a war with, say, Syria, it wouldn't be a 6-day war. It would probably be a 15-minute war. So, yes, that kind of war, I think they can still fight. What they have not been able to fight, and here Hezbollah is unique, is a serious guerrilla war. It's the first time. They are now fighting a guerrilla movement deeply entrenched in the population, and from a military point of view, pretty sophisticated. In fact, if you read the Israeli press, which I've been doing regularly, they're shocked. You know, the military is shocked. They thought, first of all, that the chief of staff, Dan Halutz, is the former Air Force chief, and Avnery pointed out, he's a pretty acute commentator, he pointed out recently that Dan Halutz, he said, is the real ruler of Israel, and he sees the world through a bomb sight. You know, so we're familiar with that from U.S. history. You can just bomb everything to oblivion, and it's fine. Well, you know, it often doesn't work. It didn't work this time. They bombed and bombed. They didn't get anywhere. They didn't want to send in ground troops because they know they're going to be fighting a guerrilla war, the same kind that drove them out in the first place. And when they went in, they had tough fighting everywhere. The Hezbollah forces were behind them, in front of them. It was kind of like fighting what the U.S. calls the Viet Cong, the propaganda term. The National Liberation Front forces in South Vietnam were just the population. And that's a tough war, you know. Not only is it tough on your own forces, but it's a war against the population. And we know what that means. So they didn't want to send in ground troops. They finally did because they couldn't get anywhere. And they've had hard fighting, and they had to, they made some, they probably killed, when they killed 1,000 Lebanese and they destroyed a large part of the country. That's the easy part. Not just Hezbollah. I mean, when they say they're attacking Hezbollah targets, that means they're attacking the civilian society. Like the southern Beirut, where actually I was a couple of months ago. It's a city, it's a poor city. And yes, that's a Hezbollah target. Most of the population are Shiites, support Hezbollah, or else Amal, which is a close ally with about the same programs. So yeah, you want to attack Hezbollah, you have to attack the civilian society. I mean, you can also get, paranoid fanatics, like our friend over in the Harvard Law School, who wrote that, he wrote an article which I don't think you could find an analog for you'd have to look in the Nazi archives to find something like it. He said 87% of Lebanese support Hezbollah resistance, so therefore all Lebanese are legitimate targets. So if anybody supports resistance to the holy state, they're a legitimate target for destruction. Try to find an analog for that. I mean, I've been thinking, I haven't been able to find one. But, yeah, so way out at the hysterical extreme, you get that view. And from there on over, it's the general, you get to the moderates who say, well, the attack on the civilian society is disproportionate. And in fact, it's not disproportionate, it's outrageous. And we know that they believe that. Just imagine that anybody had suggested after, say, the kidnapping of the Muammar brothers on June 24th, or Israel's long history of kidnapping and abducting Lebanese. Suppose anyone had suggested destroying half of Israel. I mean, you'd think it's a revival of Nazism. Okay, is this any different? Yeah, okay, it's not. So the word disproportionate is not in place, and certainly not the extremist fanatics. It's clear. It's reasonably clear what happened, and nobody comes out pure as driven snow. But our problem we should be concerned with is the United States. After all, that's us. That's what we're doing.
That Harvard Law professor is Alan Dershowitz. Well, what does this war do to the American project in Lebanon for a Cedar revolution after the assassination of the former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri on February 14, 2005? There were mass street demonstrations. Syria left the country, and 1559 was passed, and there was going to be a new era in Lebanon. It seems almost that the Israeli destruction of key aspects of the Lebanese state, I mean, the ability to provide services, transport and health care, etc., have been compromised and weakened.
Well, first of all, after the Cedar Revolution, antagonism toward and suspicion of the United States in Lebanon was higher than of Syria. So Bush would like to take credit for the Cedar Revolution, but that's not the Lebanese view. I mean, there were elements in Lebanon, like Walid Jumblatt, for example, who I mentioned, who are very, at times, varies. They're opportunistic politicians, but at times have been supportive of the United States. Shibli Malat certainly is, the other person I mentioned. And in the March 14th coalition, there are elements like that, but many are not. Again, Hezbollah is just integrated into the society, and they're not the only ones. I mean, Amal, the other major Shiite organization, has similar stands. So the Bush program we can basically forget about. This was a Lebanese program. France and the United States, again, for their own cynical reasons, for once didn't impede a move towards democracy, but that's about the most you can say. And the democracy that emerges has to be of the kind that is subordinated to U.S. interests. We can see that very clearly by the U.S. reaction to the election of Hamas. It's a very free election. Everyone agreed. Vote the wrong way. Okay, you strangle them. Punish the population. That's standard operating procedure, once again. So whatever the project, they undoubtedly did want Lebanon to reconstruct as a kind of, commercial, financial center, society, rebuilt, run for the wealthy, poor Shiites in South Beirut and South Lebanon. The government did essentially nothing for them, which is one of the reasons why Hezbollah became so powerful. It was not its military forces. It was providing social services. It was the government. It was providing health, educational services, support, and so on. And like other Islamic fundamentalist movements, that's the basis for its enormous popular support. The United States certainly didn't intend to have a democracy of the kind that's going to provide services for the population. I mean, is that the intent of the Bush administration right here, for example? I mean, we don't have to talk about that. But whatever the project may have been, it's now in ruins. The United States, the U.S. Israeli invasion has created enormous popularity for Hezbollah. It's almost undoubtedly created a new generation of jihadi terrorists all over the Arab world, Muslim worlds probably. Hezbollah has, after all, achieved something that none of the Arab states achieved. It deterred an Israeli invasion. Actually, Rami Khouri, who, is maybe the most distinguished journalist in the Arab world, a very intelligent person, one of the editors of the Daily Star in Lebanon. He wrote a while back, I think before the invasion, that he said the Arab states have been unable to deter Israeli aggression, occupation, repression, takeover of lands, and so on. They just haven't been able to deter it. As a result, non-state forces have developed, paramilitary and other non-state forces have developed to defend the population. One of them is Hamas, another one is Hezbollah. They've developed in response to the inability of the states to deter, he was too polite to say U.S., but I'll add it, U.S.-Israeli aggression, repression, takeover of lands, resources, and so on. So they developed. And he says, this is a dangerous situation. You don't want to have non-state actors inside a state, especially military ones, but that's what's going to happen. And unless the fundamental problems are dealt with, that's going to happen again. It's an inevitable, just as the U.S. and Israel substantially helped create Islamic fundamentalist extremism by destroying secular nationalism. You destroy secular nationalism, people aren't going to just say, okay, cut my throat. They're going to turn somewhere else. And the somewhere else, systematically, has been extremist religious fanaticism. Actually, there's something at a totally different level. There's something similar to that in the United States. So it shouldn't be too foreign to us. I mean, the last 25 years, which according to, press and intellectual commentators has been a golden age, has been probably the worst period in American economic history for the general population. For 25 years, for the majority, real wages have stagnated or declined. Working hours are going up. Benefits are declining. Services are declining. That's pretty unusual. It's never happened before. No depression, no major war. It's just economic policies have been designed that way. Well, associated with it is an increase in the role of religious fundamentalism in U.S. life. It's always been there. It's always been there as a big factor, but it's no secret to any of us that it's becoming more significant, partly because it's just being mobilized as a force for reaction, but partly because there's a response to the situation which is allowing it to be mobilized. It's a very familiar phenomenon. And when the United States and Israel have systematically destroyed secular nationalist movements in the Arab world, that's what you get in response. It goes way back. After all, remember that the U.S. since the Second World War, the U.S. has been the strongest outside supporter of extremist Islamic fundamentalism. I mean, Washington's oldest and most valued ally in the Arab world is Saudi Arabia. I mean, by comparison with Saudi Arabia, Iran looks like a democratic heaven, The threat to Saudi Arabian religious extremist tyranny was secular nationalism, mainly Nasser, centered around Nasser. So Nasser became an enemy because he was threatening the U.S. base of extremist religious fundamentalism, which happens to control the oil, which is the reason. So yes, Israel performed a huge service to the United States in 1967 and to Saudi Arabia and the energy corporations by essentially eliminating secular Arab nationalism, which was regarded as a threat for good reasons. It was threatening to use the resources of the region for the needs of its own population. And that's intolerable. They're our resources, as George Kennan said a long time ago, and we have to protect them. And then the same's happened time after time. I mean, Israel created Hamas by destroying secular PLO, which was calling for negotiations and settlement, which Israel didn't want, and the U.S. didn't want. So, okay, they destroyed it, and then what happens? Population doesn't disintegrate. It turned to something else. What it turned to was religious fundamentalism. The jihadi movement existed in the 70s. They killed Sadat. They're mainly Egyptian-based, but the U.S. mobilized them and gave them a huge shot in the arm by organizing them to fight the Russians in Afghanistan. Not for the Afghans, probably prolonged the Russian invasion, but it was a good way to, harm the Cold War enemy. So they created the jihadis, the radical. They were there, as I say, but they created them, and that just continues step by step. I mean, in Pakistan, which is a major center now for radical Islamism, that comes from Zia-ul-Haq, who was strongly supported by the Reagan administration. In fact, for years, all through its tenure, the Reagan administration pretended that he wasn't developing nuclear weapons. Of course, they knew he was, but every year they'd religiously certify Pakistan as not developing nuclear weapons because they wanted to support their radical extremist fundamentalist friend. They knew perfectly well that Saudi Arabia was funding extremist madrasas, schools all over Lebanon, undermined the Lebanese educational system, Pakistani educational system, which had been pretty good. And people like Pervez Hoodboy, friend of both of us who's a nuclear physicist, is deploring the fact that he can't get students anymore to study the sciences because all they're learning in school is, the Quran. They don't want to do science. That wasn't true in the past. Well, that's supported by the Reagan administration, the guys who are in office right now. Further, just like they supported Saddam Hussein. I mean, he happened to be a secular maniac, but they supported him too. I mean, they're ecumenical. They'll support, no matter, they'll support anyone who accords with U.S. policies. When Saddam Hussein was invading Iran, that U.S. favored that, so therefore big supporters of Saddam Hussein. They, in fact, pretty much won the war for him. And same, it's all over the world. I mean, I don't know if you want to go through the rest, but...
We'll talk about Hezbollah being a Shia formation and its co-religionists in Iraq and Iran. And I just want to point out on August 4th, there was a massive rally in Baghdad where hundreds of thousands of Iraqis turned out chanting death to Israel and death to America.
Yeah. You have to give Rumsfeld and Cheney and Wolfowitz credit. They created a Shiite state in Iraq, which has close links to Iran, and may turn out to be another religious fundamentalist state. They created it. It wasn't there before. Whatever they thought they were doing, that's what they created. And yes, the government, in fact, the parliament passed, I think, a unanimous resolution or something close to that, condemning the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And the prime minister, of course, made a strong statement condemning the invasion. He got a lot of flack about that when he came to the United States. Some Democratic congressional representatives boycotted him because he dared to condemn a U.S.-Israeli invasion of another country. You're not allowed to do that. For liberal Democrat, that's outrageous. But sure, that's their position. And it's the position of the mass of the population all over the Arab world. I mean, even you read the New York Times reports. I mean, they do report that the tyrannies that run the countries criticize Hezbollah, but they also point out that that was in open defiance of their own populations. And in fact, they've had to back down. Like King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia was very much worried about Iran and the Shiite movements, nevertheless was compelled by popular opinion, and that's a tyranny. So, you don't just listen to the public unless it becomes dangerous. He was compelled to say that if this aggression continues, Saudi Arabia will have to react as to a criminal invasion,
The relentless carnage and mayhem in Iraq, the deaths are in the thousands now, internal refugees, de facto partition has even driven a big supporter of the war, the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist of the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, to back off from his support. Where do you see U.S. policy in Iraq going?
Well, they have a real dilemma. All the talk about withdrawal strategies is essentially worthless unless it faces a fundamental point. The U.S. cannot withdraw from Iraq. It cannot leave Iraq as a sovereign, independent state. I mean, cannot is strong. It'd be an immense defeat. It's nothing like Vietnam. The analogies are worthless. I mean, in the case of Vietnam, they could destroy the country and walk out, basically win the war. Those are their major objectives. They can get the maximal ones. They got the main objectives. You can't do that in Iraq. It's much too valuable. Not only in itself, second largest oil reserves in the world and very accessible ones, but its position right in the center of the energy producing regions, right next door to Iran and Saudi Arabia. You can't leave it to it would be like a nightmare for them to leave it to its own population, which would, of course, have a Shiite majority and would link up, tighten relations with Iran, as it's already doing. And there's more to it. I mean, right across by a strange accident of geography, major energy reserves of the world happen to be in Shiite-dominated areas. So Saudi Arabia is the major energy reserves. They're mostly right there on the border of Iraq, which is it's a majority, but certainly a very large Shiite population, which has been bitterly repressed by the U.S.-backed tyranny and is being spurred to move for greater rights, maybe even autonomy or something, by the fact that the Iraqi Shiites are now gaining some degree of control over policy. So you have the possibility of a kind of a loose Shiite alliance, including Shiite Iran, mostly Shiite Iran, Shiite Iraq, Shiite corner of Saudi Arabia, independent of Washington, controlling most of the world's energy. I mean, as if that wasn't bad enough, they may well turn to the east. You know, the United States can intimidate Europe and they back off, but they can't intimidate China, which is one of the reasons for the fear of China. Just won't be intimidated. You know, they've been around for 3,000 years. Contempt for the barbarians, they proceed. The U.S. tells them to back off. They continue to invest. When President Hu of China visited here last year, the Bush administration thought they could insult him by denying him a state dinner and he could just have a state lunch. He was polite, and then he turned the insult around very elegantly. He flew from Washington to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, where he made new investment and trade relations with Saudi Arabia. It's now one of Saudi Arabia's leading trading partners, providing them even with military equipment. I mean, this must terrify the civilian planners in the Pentagon, the military planners. Saudi Arabia is the chief jewel. All of these factors have to be brought into consideration of the question of withdrawal. It's not a technical question of how do you get the troops out. It has nothing to do with fomenting a civil war. They're not concerned about that, and probably the occupation's increasing it. But it has real motives, and you can't present sensible plans if you don't pay attention to the motives. The main motive is that a sovereign, mildly democratic Iraq would be an utter catastrophe for U.S. planners. Well, that has to be brought into account.
Well, not content with their success in Iraq, neocon intellectuals, if I may use that term, like Bill Kristol in the Weekly Standard writes that we might consider countering this act of Iranian aggression, that's what he calls Lebanon, with a military strike against Iranian nuclear facilities. Why wait, he asks. Does anyone think a nuclear Iran can be contained, that the current regime will negotiate in good faith? It would be easier to act sooner rather than later. Yes, there would be repercussions, and they would be healthy ones, showing a strong America that has rejected further appeasement.
Well, as Kristol certainly knows, the shoe is on the other foot. The Iranian government has been proposing negotiations for years. We now know, and he undoubtedly knows, that in 2003, the Khatami government, the moderate government, but with the approval of the hardline clerical rulers, offered to negotiate all outstanding issues with the United States. That included nuclear issues. It also included a two-state settlement for the Israel-Palestine problem, which, as I mentioned, Iran officially supports. The Bush administration didn't reject the negotiation offer. It didn't even reply to it. Its response was to censure the Swiss diplomat who brought the offer. Well, that continues. It's the U.S. that's refusing negotiations. There's a big hoopla now about Condi Rice shifted policy. Now they're willing to negotiate. No, that's not true. They're willing to negotiate if Iran concedes the result of the negotiations before the negotiations. So the negotiations are conditional on Iran stopping uranium enrichment, which it's legally entitled to do, which is supposed to be the goal of the negotiations. So, yeah, we'll negotiate if they first concede in advance, and also with a gun pointed at their heads. Because we won't withdraw the threats. And they've made it very clear. We continue the threats, which are a violation of the UN Charter, of course, and they have to agree in advance to what we want them to do, and then we'll negotiate along with Europe. So in other words, the U.S. is still refusing to negotiate. Iran's government is not a nice government. All kind of hideous things you can say about it. But the fact is, on this issue, they're the ones who've offered negotiations. They're the ones who've said that they would accept a two-state settlement in Israel-Palestine. They're the ones who say, well, let's deal with it. In fact, it goes beyond that. I mean, the issue of enriching uranium to weapons grade is a very serious problem. The fate of the species depends on it. If that continues, we're not going to survive much longer. Well, there are proposals as to how to deal with it. The major proposal comes from Mohammed al-Baradei, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Nobel Prize laureate last year, and highly respected. His proposal a couple of years ago was that production of weapons-grade fissile materials be under international control, supervision, and anyone who wants to apply for fissile materials can apply to the International Agency for Peaceful Use. That's a very sensible proposal. As far as I'm aware, there's only one country in the world that's accepted it, Iran. Try to find a reference to that somewhere. But they did, officially. Ali Larijani, their main negotiator. It's known. You can't not know it. So, again, plenty of criticisms. I mean, Iran's got a horrible government, undoubtedly repressive and so on. But in these domains, its position is far more forthcoming than that of the United States. Actually, one can say the same about Hamas and U.S.-Israel. Again, plenty of things wrong with Hamas. I mean, last government I'd want to live under. But their position happens to be more forthcoming than that of the United States and Israel. Might as well face reality.